I'm standing ankle-deep in cold harbor water, watching pieces of my sailboat drift past me like broken memories, and the strangest thing is I don't feel angry yet. I feel quiet, the kind of quiet that shows up right before something in your life snaps into a new shape. 3 hours earlier, that boat was still tied to the dock. 3 hours later, it was splinters, oil sheen, and silence. That boat wasn't just fiberglass and rigging. I rebuilt her with my own hands after my wife died. Weekend after weekend, sanding teak until my fingers went numb, replacing lines that hadn't been touched since the 80s, fixing things slowly because I didn't know how else to breathe back then. When you lose someone like that, you don't fix yourself all at once. You fix small things. You fix what's in front of you. That boat became my way back. And now she was gone. I heard heels clicking on wood behind me, confident, unhurried. I didn't have to turn around and know who it was. Well, a woman's voice said, bright and sharp like she was commenting on a garden upgrade. "Are you feeling better now, Noah?" I turned. There she was, Diane Holloway, president of the Shoreline Crest Homeowners Association. Perfect hair, white linen jacket, wine glass already in her hand, even though it was barely noon. She stood on her dock, looking at the wreckage like she'd just finished decluttering a room. "Thanks for asking, Diane," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I'm doing just fine." That threw her off. She blinked, tilted her head, probably waiting for shouting or tears or something messy she could feel justified about. Instead, I smiled. Not because I was happy, because 3 weeks earlier, I'd found something in my uncle's study that changed everything. But she didn't know that yet. 3 weeks before the demolition crew showed up, I was sitting in my Uncle Raymond's old house, surrounded by dust, salt-stained paperwork, and the kind of silence that only shows up in homes where someone lived alone for a long time. He'd left me the place when he passed, along with a mess of documents nobody else wanted to deal with. Boat registrations, dock permits, old Marina invoices. Waterfront stuff. That's when I found the folder. Thick, yellowed, labeled in block letters. Seabrook Point Marina Corporation. Inside were incorporation papers from the early 60s, stock certificates, lease maps, water boundary surveys. I remember laughing softly at first, thinking it was some long-dead business idea that never went anywhere. Then I kept reading, and reading slowed down. My hand started to shake. There was a letter tucked inside, written in my uncle's handwriting. He'd always written like he talked. Direct. No wasted words. "Noah, if you're reading this, it probably means someone is giving you hell about your boat. Happens every generation. People forget who owns the water. Thought you should know you own most of it. Signed, Ray." Turns out, I wasn't just sorting through old paperwork. I was holding proof that I owned 68% of the Marina Corporation that controlled the water rights for the entire cove. Every dock, every slip, every inch of navigable water extending out from shore. The HOA owned land access. They didn't own the water. They never had, including Diane Holloway's dock. I leaned back in that chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the wind come off the bay through a cracked window. For 3 years, Diane had been terrorizing boat owners, issuing violations, finding people, threatening removals, telling fishermen their gear was ugly, claiming authority she didn't actually have. And now I knew why she was so confident. Nobody had ever challenged her. I could have shut it down right there. One lawyer letter, one official filing, and she would have backed off, maybe resigned, maybe sold her house, and vanished into the next upscale coastal development. But people like Diane don't learn that way. They don't change because they're corrected. They change because they break something so badly that everyone sees who they really are. So I decided to wait. I watched her the way you watch a storm building offshore. Come at first. Predictable patterns. I kept notes. Every violation notice. Every threat. Every time she stepped outside her lane and in a maritime law she clearly didn't understand. I listened to the fishermen, to the old-timers who'd been quietly pushed out over the years. The stories all sounded the same. Pressure, feeness, shame, leave quietly or be ruined. Diane had a type, and she never stopped once she got started. A week later, she showed up at my dock with a clipboard and a man I'd never seen before wearing deck shoes that had never touched water. She called him a marine assessor. He called my restored sailboat aesthetically incompatible. I almost laughed. 2 days after that, the violation notice arrived. Daily fines, final warnings, enforcement action pending. I thanked her politely and filed everything away. My lawyer confirmed what I already knew. HOAs don't control navigable water. Marina corporações do. And Diane Holloway was about to find out what happens when someone mistakes confidence for authority. Because she was getting greedy now, and greedy people always make the same mistake. They go too far. Once Diane decided my boat was her problem, she couldn't leave it alone. That's the thing about people who confuse authority with identity. Once you threaten that identity, even quietly, they spiral. Every interaction after that inspection felt less like enforcement and more like obsession. She started showing up unannounced. Clipboard, phone camera, always smiling like she was doing me a favor. She'd stand at the edge of my dock, heels balanced perfectly, pointing out imaginary flaws with a kind of performative concern. You know, Noah, she said one morning, squinting at my rigging, if something were to fail out here, it could be very dangerous for the community. I looked at her, sanding dust still on my hands. Dangerous how? She smiled wider. Well, boats sink. Things break. Accidents happen. It wasn't a threat exactly. More like a wish said out loud. A few days later, she sent someone else. A cousin. A friend. Some guy with a laminated badge that looked like it had been printed at home. He stepped onto my deck without asking, grabbed a shroud to steady himself, and set off every bell and wind chime within 50 yards. The whole harbor turned to look. Structurally questionable, he announced, dangling awkwardly. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. That night, the fine notices escalated. $100 a day, then $150. Then language about emergency removal if compliance wasn't achieved. Each letter more aggressive than the last. I filed every single one away. Timestamps, dates, signatures. Meanwhile, I started making calls. Turns out Diane wasn't just overstepping with me. Old fishermen told me she'd forced them to move traps because they were visually disruptive. A retired couple sold their trawler after being fined into exhaustion. A charter captain lost his slip after refusing to repaint his boat to match the HOA's preferred palette. The pattern was always the same. Pressure until people folded. Quiet victories. No weaknesses. Until now, when word spread that someone was pushing back, people started talking. Over coffee. At the Marina diner. In low voices at first. Then louder. The local paper caught wind of it. HOA versus boat owner. Property values versus working harbor. They loved that angle. Diane hated the attention. She called an emergency HOA meeting and invited town officials, the harbor master, anyone she thought might legitimize her. She showed up with slides comparing luxury yachts to my modest sailboat, talking about consistency and standards like she was presenting quarterly earnings. And then something shifted. One fisherman stood up, then another. They didn't yell. They didn't insult her. They just talked about history, about how the harbor had existed long before Shoreline Crest was built, about working boats and salt and families who'd been there for generations. Diane's smile cracked that night. 2 days later, she crossed from nuisance into danger. I was packing my truck for a weekend trip to see my sister inland when my phone rang. It was Eli, one of the fishermen. Noah, he said, voice tight, you need to come back. Why? They're tearing your boat apart. The drive back felt unreal. I kept telling myself it had to be a misunderstanding. Some bluff. Some intimidation tactic. But when I pulled into the lot and saw the empty pilings, the debris floating where my boat used to sit, something inside me went cold. She hadn't waited for permits. She hadn't contacted the harbor master. She hired a private demolition crew and told them it was an emergency. My boat's engine was cracked open like an egg. Fuel leaked into the water. Pieces of teak I'd restored by hand bobbed uselessly against the dock. The smell of diesel mixed with salt and sawdust. Diane stood on her deck again, wine glass raised. Emergency action, she called out. You understand? I didn't answer. I just took photos. Every angle, every slick, every license plate on the demolition truck still parked nearby. That night, I filed police reports, insurance claims, environmental complaints. The demolition company admitted they never pulled permits. They assumed the HOA had authority. Their contract was with Diane personally. That detail mattered more than she realized. The next morning, environmental inspectors showed up at her property. Unpermitted dock modifications. Runoff into protected shellfish beds. Violations stacking up fast. Diane's voice carried across the water, sharp and shrill, as the reality set in. But she still thought she could talk her way out. That's when I decided it was time. I called for an emergency community meeting. Public notice. Waterfront Authority clarification. Diane showed up confident, dressed for war, lawyers in tow. She thought I was there to negotiate, to settle. I brought my uncle's folder. I stood at the podium and let the room settle. Then I told them who owned the marina, who always had, what authority actually looked like on paper. You could hear the air leave Diane's lungs. She tried to interrupt. I didn't let her. By the time I finished, she wasn't angry anymore. She was scared, and scared people don't retreat. They lash out, which is exactly what Diane Holloway did next. Fear doesn't make people careful. It makes them sloppy. Once Diane realized the room had shifted, that people were no longer nodding along or avoiding eye contact, she went into survival mode. And survival, for someone like her, meant doubling down on the only weapon she'd ever known, intimidation dressed up as righteousness. Within 48 hours of that meeting, she hired a real lawyer, the kind who wore expensive suits and spoke entirely in controlled size. She started telling anyone who would listen that I was unstable, that grief had made me obsessive, that I was exploiting old paperwork to steal value from the community. She used words like harassment and vendetta, an unsafe veteran. What she didn't realize was that every call, every rumor, every whispered warning she spread was being forwarded to me by the same neighbors she'd bullied for years. People she thought were allies. People who were finally tired. Then she made the worst mistake of all. She tried to buy her way out. She approached a county official she assumed was friendly, slid an envelope across a desk, and spoke in that careful half-language people use when they think they're being subtle. The official declined, politely, then reported the conversation. Turns out, the county had already been watching her. Waterfront disputes have a way of attracting attention, especially when environmental violations and unpermitted construction are involved. Her attempt at influence didn't make things go away. It made them federal. By the time Diane realized she was in real trouble, her lawyer had withdrawn, her HOA board had distanced themselves, and her husband had stopped returning calls. The confident woman who once waved from her dock was now pacing, unraveling, snapping at contractors, trying to erase evidence faster than it could be documented. And that's when Harbor Festival weekend arrived. Every summer, the town celebrates the water. Music, food, boats open for tours, families everywhere. Diane had spent years positioning herself as the unofficial face of waterfront elegance. This was supposed to be her moment to salvage her image. Instead, it became her public reckoning. That morning, I watched from my rebuilt dock as she ordered workers to dismantle parts of her illegal dock extension, chainsaws cutting into wood without permits, debris falling straight into protected water. She wasn't fixing anything. She was panicking. Environmental officers arrived just as the festival crowds started forming. Cameras came out. Clipboards appeared. Citations were issued in real time. And then, right as Diane stormed toward the main stage to make one last speech about property values and community standards, the thing she'd ignored for years finally gave up. Her oversized boat lift failed. Metal groaned. Chains snapped. The entire structure collapsed, sending her yacht sliding sideways into the harbor. The splash was enormous. Fuel leaked instantly, a rainbow slick spreading across the water she claimed to protect. No one spoke for a moment. Then the crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts, phones recording everything. Environmental teams moving fast, deploying containment booms, treating it like the hazard it was. Diane stood frozen at the edge of the dock, staring at her sinking boat, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "This isn't fair." An officer stepped beside her. "Ma'am, you're under arrest." They cuffed her right there, in front of the town, the cameras, the water, for environmental crimes, for obstruction, for attempted bribery, for destruction of property. The list was long. Her husband didn't step forward. He just turned and walked away. The festival continued, strangely enough. Music resumed. Kids ate funnel cake. The town breathed out. It felt like something heavy had finally been lifted. 6 months later, the harbor looks different. Quieter, cleaner, more honest. Diane served time. Not much, but enough. Her husband lost his business. Their house was sold, bought by a fishing family she once tried to push out. The Marina Corporation was reactivated properly. New leases, clear rules, real authority. I never rebuilt my old boat. Instead, I teach sailing now. Kids who never thought the water belonged to them learn how to read the wind, how to trust themselves, how to move forward even after something they loved was taken from them. Sometimes people ask if it was worth it, letting it go that far, letting her destroy something I cared about just to expose the truth. I don't always have a clean answer, but I know this power that isn't checked will always take more. And sometimes the only way to stop it is to let it reveal itself completely. So here's my question for you. If someone destroys something you love using authority they never had, do you stop them early and walk away? Or do you let them go just far enough to make sure they can never do it to anyone else again? Tell me what you think.